Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and if someone were to ask you, what's the most serious threat to Jewish life today? You might think of issues in the news, a nuclear Iran, BDS that challenges Israel's very legitimacy and existence, the conundrum of the Israeli political system that gives small ultra-Orthodox parties a wildly disproportionate power over aspects of Israeli life, or the increasing degree of Jewish assimilation within American Jewry. Any one of these, and other issues which you may feel are especially threatening to Jewish life. They may be at the top of your list. But there are those in the Jewish community who understand that all of these problems are second to the overarching, transcending threat to Jewish life, and even perhaps to the future of the State of Israel: Jewish ignorance. There's a gaping hole in Jewish knowledge and understanding about the Jewish tradition, to be sure, and with regard to the State of Israel. You've heard many of the brightest and most committed Jews say it over and over again. The key to a vibrant Jewish future is education, education, education. Jews of America, Jews of the world, need to be informed and educated if they're to be committed and engaged in the Jewish future and the well-being of the State of Israel. And those of you who watch JBS on a regular basis, you know this is what JBS is all about: expanding Jewish understanding, informing, educating, hopefully inspiring a closer connection to and identification with the Jewish people, the Jewish tradition, and the State of Israel. And there are others passionately committed to these same goals, and who also use media in the largest sense of the word to inform, educate, and inspire engagement in Jewish life. And in the last few years, one of the most effective media outlets to be enormously successful in these endeavors is an online news website named the Algemeiner. For many years, the Algemeiner was a Yiddish newspaper. It was not a major player on the Jewish scene. But then one young visionary revitalized the Algemeiner and has transformed it into one of the most important voices on the world Jewish scene, an international online website featuring news relating to Israel, the Middle East, and the range of issues confronting contemporary Jewish life today. And on this edition of L'Chaim, I have the enormous pleasure to introduce you to the visionary behind the Algemeiner, Dovid Efune, editor-in-chief of the Algemeiner and director of its parent nonprofit organization, the Gershon Jacobson Foundation. It is wonderful having you at this table. I am a huge fan of yours, of what you do, and it's a really kick for me to be able to sit with you here on L'Chaim. Thank you for making the journey out to sit with me at this table.
And thank you for having me. The pleasure is really all mine.
That's sweet of you. So there's so much I want to know about you, beginning with who the heck you are. You obviously have an accent. Where were you born?
I was born in England.
Where?
In a small town in the north called Manchester.
Yes.
But I left there when I was about 2, and I have never been back.
Really? Your family came too?
Moved down first to London and then to a little town on the south coast called Brighton.
Okay, so most of your young years were brought up somewhere in London, somewhere in Great Britain.
Correct. Correct.
When do you come to America?
Well, I first came to the United States in 2002 to study at a yeshiva in Miami, South Beach. Subsequently, I studied for another year at a yeshiva in Brooklyn. Then I left the US for about 3 years to continue studies.
Where?
In South Africa, primarily, South Africa. And then I returned in 2008 to start doing what I'm doing now.
Okay. And why South Africa?
Well, South Africa, I originally went there to work at a school. There's a Jewish school there called Torah Academy, which is a fantastic school. And my father is actually South African, so I have a lot of South African family. And when the opportunity arose, I thought it might be a good idea to go down there, do some community service, but at the same time, see where my father grew up, meet the community, and get to know what it was all about.
Okay, that is lovely. And what kind of Jewish home do you grow up in Great Britain?
Well, I grew up in a Chabad home. My father is the Chabad emissary in Brighton, the south of England, Rabbi Pesach Efune. But his parents and my mother's parents grew up quite secular, actually.
Really?
And they discovered Judaism later on in their lives through my parents, who discovered it when they were quite young.
By the way, take us for one moment to what you know about your parents' and mother's journey. They start secular. Your father ends up not only in Chabad, but as a shaliach, an emissary. How does that happen? Do you know?
Well, for my father, it was quite straightforward. I think he was going to a Hebrew day school in South Africa, which was, I believe, on weekends. And there was a teacher there who was particularly inspiring, and he took the teachings to heart, and at quite a young age told his parents, I want to be more Jewishly engaged, I want to start observing Shabbat. I think he was 10 or 11 years old at the time, he was very young. And his mother, my grandmother, was supportive. He ended up going to yeshiva, and the rest is history. With my mother, it's more of an interesting and complex story, because her mother, my grandmother, grew up in a Hasidic family in Vienna. Her father was a leader in the community, a rabbi in the community, who was killed by the Nazis quite early on, in 1939, I believe, at Buchenwald. So my grandmother and her sisters escaped to England on the Kindertransport.
Wow.
So she went to live with another family, which was not her own family. And obviously, growing up without parents, she started to secularize and become, more mainstream, I would say. And my grandfather grew up in a much more mainstream home. But when they came together and started having children, when my mother was born, particularly in 1961, the Chabad emissaries there, my grandfather was a successful businessman. They saw it as a great opening to come and introduce their work to him and to win over his support, which was very successful. They ended up taking him to meet the Chabad Rabbi in 1963, and they developed a long and extensive relationship. He soon became the chair of the UK Friends of Chabad as a lay leader. And after being involved to such a degree, he felt that his own children should be in the schools that he was advocating for. So he moved my mother and her sisters into the Chabad school. And then, as they say, the rest is history.
So you grow up in an Orthodox home in
Correct.
Great Britain. And your mother is therefore second generation, correct?
Survivor, yeah.
Yes?
Correct. My grandmother was a survivor.
Right. And so your mother was second generation.
Correct.
Do you think it affected your mother?
I'm sure it did. It's hard to say how, because God bless her, I cannot say anything negative at all about my mother. But
what's her name?
Penina.
Penina.
There are all kinds of ways that it can affect people, and I'm not a psychologist. All I can say is that we grew up with a sense, I would say, of pride in our Judaism, a sense of responsibility in what it means to be Jewish, and also an incredible sense of identity, living in the south of England, where Orthodox Jews are harder to find over there than
yes. Oh, I wanted to ask you.
Yes.
I have had other people here at this table who grew up as British Jews. Some of them had very hard time. There was anti-Semitism. There at times was even physical abuse of Jews. In terms of your own experience growing up in the south of England, what was it like for you in terms of the larger culture? Did you deal with anti-Semitism as a major problem or not?
Well, I think that there certainly is more anti-Semitism there than you feel here. I mean, you're walking in the street and somebody will shout something. It's sort of what I might call pedestrian anti-Semitism. You know, from time to time, you know, we had some, I think in the course of my early years, maybe 3 or 4 physical altercations, you know, a punch here or somebody grabbed my yarmulke over there. It's different to here because, you know, you're left with an understanding, I think, with a sense that you are different and that you're seen as different. And that can have good aspects to it. It leaves you with a strong sense of identity, but also negative aspects. But I think you're very aware of your Judaism growing up in the UK, and I would say that today. Mm-hmm, you know, you're conscious of it, and there's a sense
in a different way than American Jews are.
In a different way, I walking around the United States and frankly walking around South Africa, I've never felt conscious as a Jew wearing a yarmulke and looking conspicuously Jewish, as I think one does in Europe, in England, in France, and Eastern Europe, and other places. It's a different feeling.
Yes. You studied for the rabbinate?
That's correct.
You have smicha?
That's correct.
Double smicha or one?
That's correct.
Yes. How'd that happen?
Well, I studied once, but I was examined twice. It's a great program in Pretoria, South Africa, where I studied. And in order for one smicha to be accepted by as many potential employees as possible, they thought it'd be a good idea to have different denominations, types of rabbis ordain the rabbinical students.
I see.
So I have one from a Chabad rabbi and another from a, say, modern Orthodox rabbi from Mochon Ariel in Jerusalem.
Okay.
Studied once, 2 exams.
Very nice. Have you ever served as a rabbi?
I haven't.
Okay. You have any desire to do that?
No.
Okay. So why did you get smicha?
Well, I think first of all, you know, in my education, let's just say I wasn't given a lot of choice. I'm not sure that I would have chosen anything differently if I had been, but it's kind of you know, in the Chabad educational program, there's kind of a system, and we're strongly encouraged to go through with it and see it to the end, which is what I did in my case, and I ended up with a master's in Hebrew letters and a couple of rabbinic degrees.
Good for you. So it's obvious, but I want to ask you anyway. I've mentioned you already as someone who is young. Everything's relative in life, but you're on the young side in terms of contemporary American Jewish leadership. How old are you? As we sit at this table, how old are you?
32.
32. You're married.
Correct.
You have children.
Yes.
How many?
3.
3. You come to America. You come to America from South Africa now, you tell us.
Yes.
And you come to be involved with the Algemeiner?
That's correct.
Okay, so the next part of the story is, how in the world do you get involved with the Algemeiner?
Well,
which was very different when you first came here.
It was very different.
Okay, but you came here to do this for a reason.
That's
How'd
correct.
that happen?
Well, it started back in 2005 when I was studying at a yeshiva here in Brooklyn. And one of the rabbis there was a fellow called Yossi Jacobson, Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, who's quite a well-known orator and speaker and teacher. And he was the son, or the youngest son, of Gershon Jacobson, who was the founder of the Algemeiner. And he's a very charismatic, empowering rabbi, and I would say I was privileged to have quite a close relationship with him. And he took an active interest in the students' lives. And it was actually that year that his father passed away. And the only interaction I ever had with Gershon Jacobson was after he had passed. Yossi asked myself and some other boys to, you know, there's a tradition to say psalms at the body, at the morgue, in the night before someone who's passed away is buried, and they needed someone for the wee hours of the morning, from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. or something like that. So
you were a shomer.
I was a showman, so I went with a friend down there, and I think it's kind of an intimate experience, actually, and you feel this connection with the soul, I think, in some way. So following that experience, we became much closer, myself and Yossi, and started to speak about his father's legacy. And a couple of years later, when they were looking for someone who could come along and try and take the core mission, which always remained the same, although it displayed itself in different iterations throughout the year, but take the core mission, apply it to the 21st century. They were crazy enough to think that it might be a good idea to give me a shot. I guess they didn't have a lot of money at the time, and I was very cheap, so...
Well, that could have played into it, but they were very, very lucky and precocious in some way. They had great insight. Did you have a journalist background in any sense?
No, not at all. And the truth is that my role on day one is not the same as it was now.
What was it initially?
Well, it was, the title I had was director of the Gershon Jacobson Foundation, which was the umbrella group named after Gershon that owned and operated the enterprise, a 501c3 charitable organization. So I didn't actually become the editor until later on as well, and that was when we started switching things over to be an English publication, and then there was kind of need to step in and take over some other responsibilities. But while there was a period of 2 or 3 years, I think, where I had the opportunity to see things in motion, also learn from some really incredible people, and there were a number that were very helpful with their time and generous with their time and their advice and their guidance in the early days that I would say played a great role in helping me understand the craft to the best of my ability.
So in many ways you grew into the role you have now.
I think that's fair to say.
How do you define the transformation from again, is being a Yiddish newspaper, nice, but very limited, and then at one point it becomes English language, and then it really is online, and I don't know, how many people are online with you every day?
Per day, but on a good month we can get up to 3 million.
Isn't that marvelous?
Yes.
And if I'm overstating it, you tell me. It seems to me that the Algemeiner now wields a certain amount of influence. It's not like you're kingmakers, but people care what you write and what's reported in the Algemeiner. Am I being fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, and to the point that you were making earlier, I think there is a tremendous responsibility that comes with that. But when the way that I see it, and I think the way that we see it, when we look back and we look forward, there's so much more that needs to be done. The goal and the mission that we have is so central and vital to the Jewish cause.
Define it for me.
That we don't have the opportunity to look over our shoulder and analyze, how big or serious
I'll
it is.
do that, right.
Our focus is to move forward as rapidly and as quickly as we can.
Get through the day.
To achieve the goals that we can on behalf of the Jewish cause.
What's your mission statement as you see it?
It's very simple. The Jewish people need a voice. We live today in what some people have defined as the information age. This is a historical definition similar to the Iron Age or the Bronze Age, where people look back and understand the centrality that flows of information, the expansion of information have in today's world. And this is something that, for example, Michael Oren wrote about in his book Ally. He says one of the first things that he came to understand when he came to Washington was that the entire White House agenda is driven by what's written about in the media today. And obviously that's the case with President Trump many times over. We live in a media-centric environment, a media-centric society. And there are lots of competing voices that compete for our attention, that compete to be heard, that compete to have a place of prominence at the table of ideas in the international community. And the Jewish people for so long have not really, there are a lot of voices, there are internal voices, there's a lot of discussion that happens among ourselves, but when we need to say to the world, here are our priorities, here are our perspectives, here's what we feel is important for you to pay attention to, what the Jewish people, the Jewish cause would like you to notice today, that we're lacking, I think, greatly lacking in that regard. And that's what we're looking to build, a voice that's global, that's respected, that can speak to the heart of Jewish sensitivities, but not just to the Jewish community, but can speak to humankind and to the world.
You're the new kid on the block in this arena. How have the established, the Jewish Weeks and the Forwards and some of the other, even throughout, the LA Journal, how have you been treated?
That's a very good question, and I guess to be a fly on the wall might be interesting. I can't say we've had any particularly negative experiences. I mean, obviously there's ideological differences, and there are clashes on the column inches from both sides. I mean, we've been critical of other Jewish papers, and they've been critical of different things that we've done. But I think that's all part of the healthy dialogue and discourse. To be honest, because we're so outwardly focused, we don't think about it too much. I mean, I think there's a great deal of value that other Jewish papers bring to the table, and there are a lot of issues that they focus on that we don't see as being particularly within our bandwidth. So I think we're all the papers that are out there are contributing to the conversation in some way, and I think we wish them well and want to be as supportive as possible. And in the meantime, we're very focused on our particular mission, which we hear time and time again from readers, is that we're reading things on your publication that we don't see anywhere else. And it's important for us to be able to bring something new to the table.
Okay, and why do you think that happens? You've put your finger on something very important, David. There are things you'll find in the Algemeiner you won't find, but you're becoming more and more mainstream, you're important. But there's this phrase in America, mainstream media. So the Jewish community has its mainstream media. Very often, I learn things and see things in the Algemeiner I'm not seeing in any other Jewish publication. How and why does that happen?
Well, I think there's a few parts to it. First of all, I believe that every publication has to in some way have a mission statement that guides them on a daily basis. I don't mean kind of a long-term goal and plans. I mean, when you're choosing the stories that you can write, how do you make that decision? At the end of the day, media influence, I would say, is probably 70% a product of which stories you decide to publish. There's a lot of discussion about how stories are published, bias in media, misinformation. But I think the biggest choice that editors make, and that applies to us, it applies to the New York Times, you have a limited amount of space, you have a limited amount of human resources, there's a certain amount of stories that you can publish on any given day. Which ones are you going to pick? What is your focus? What are your priorities? Really, that's what we have, is the question that we have to ask us every day is what are our priorities? And we try to make an objective analysis every day. What are the issues that are most important to the Jewish cause?
But are your priorities different, you think, than some of the other major Jewish newspapers?
I think they are for a couple of different reasons. First of all, because in a general sense, we view ourselves as an outwardly focused publication. So there are a number of issues that are very, very important for Jews among themselves, and those are things usually that we're not as focused on as some of the other publications.
For example?
So I think that's a very central part of it. For example, the discussion about the Orthodox going to the army, the discussion about Woman of the Wall, for example. It's an important internal discussion, but we haven't seen that as kind of a central focus of our coverage because of what we see as our purpose and our goal.
And a story that would be a priority of yours, as opposed to Orthodox serving in the IDF or Women of the Wall. Instead of that kind of story, what's the kind of story that is in your priority list, which would be a matter of focus and attention for the Algemeiner? Well,
I'll give you a couple of ideas, recent ideas. We've established in the not so distant past a campus bureau where we actually have a group of staff who are focused on covering the challenges, the plight, if you will, the opportunities also that Jewish and pro-Israel students face on American and international college campuses. And yes, a lot of these issues are covered by other publications, but we find time and time again that we are the originator of such stories. And I think the reason is that we've seen it as a point of real focus for us. And I'll give you just one example. We're in New Jersey, and Rutgers University is not so far away. Our senior campus correspondent, Shiri Moshe, who's a fantastically talented member of our staff, uncovered recently that Rutgers had employed a former spokesman for the Assad regime as an adjunct professor. And we reached out to Rutgers for comment. They defended it as a matter of free speech, and it ultimately became national and international news. There are dozens and dozens of examples. We were the first also to report that Tufts University was planning a BDS resolution over Pesach when the Jewish students couldn't stick up for themselves. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we've made a focus. And I'll give another example because I think this is important, and this is a product of our senior correspondent, Ben Cohen, who is another brilliant colleague who is a very instrumental player in our success, who has been leading coverage of the Kurdish issue taking place now in northern Iraq, where Iranian-backed Shiite militias have been taking large pieces of land. And I think a lot of people have missed the Jewish angle. And by establishing contact with sources within the Kurdish regional government, we've established that these Iranian-backed militias have taken the Sinjar mountain range, which is strategically elevated in a position that makes it quite dangerous for Israel's strategic interests. It's not so far from Tel Aviv, and the elevation makes it easier to fire various missiles. And at the same time, the land that they've taken has given them a contiguous path running from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and right up to the Golan Heights. If you look at what Israeli leaders are talking about today, their greatest challenge is the Iranian presence in Syria. And now there is a contiguous land flow from Iran straight through to the Golan Heights that has unfolded in the last couple of weeks. And there has been minuscule coverage in Jewish media outlets. I would say it's probably the single greatest development, that the threatening development towards the Jewish state in the past month.
What do you think the percentage of the stories you do and the work you do is what we would call investigative journalism, as opposed to reportage? How much investigation does you and your staff do?
Well, it's a good question. Because we're a small team, we don't have the luxury that we would like to have at some stage. So usually, if we get the sense of something, if we see something that looks like the tip of the iceberg, then we'll set aside more time to investigate it more thoroughly and dedicate attention to the story. So it's not necessarily part of our day-to-day routine, but when it's necessary, we see an opportunity, we try and jump on it, make sure that we assign the right amount of resources to it.
Okay. Also, what's your philosophy on expose? To what extent do you feel a Jewish media organ or a newspaper, a news-oriented Jewish outlet has a responsibility to be A, a whistleblower, or B, to report on sometimes salacious material that relates to what Jews are doing? This time I'm not asking you a resource question. I'm asking you a philosophical question. I mean, it's a question I deal with all the time. Here we have a mainstream Jewish television channel that's in, 50 million homes globally. I have to decide, and you have to decide, to what extent is a story about a rabbi who did something inappropriate in his congregation, does that become mainstream news on JBS? And you have to decide to what extent is it something that the Algemeiner is going to feature. And that is a philosophical question. I have my own answer. I'm curious as what your answer is.
Well, look, usually this is what I would say is not our area of focus. Having said that, I do think certainly if these are activities that are affecting the community, it's very important that they're covered. In terms of what's a Jewish issue and what's not a Jewish issue, our general thought is for negative and for positive. Just because the person happens to be Jewish, it doesn't necessarily make it a Jewish story. So, for example, there are some publications that, every time Gal Gadot does something, for example, that's news because she's the most famous Israeli. But for us, usually we try, if we're going to cover something that Gal Gadot is doing, we usually look for what we might call a double hook, which is the fact that she is a very famous Israeli movie star, but she's also doing something Jewish. She's talking about her history, her Holocaust survivor grandparents, or she's celebrating Hanukkah, or whatever it is. So it's not just the fact that she's Israeli, it's her doing something that has a Jewish-related angle. And I think in the same way, when it comes to coverage of Harvey Weinstein or Bernie Madoff, I think to make that Jewish, that these horrendous activities that these people are engaged in are not because they're Jewish, but despite the fact that they're Jewish. These are not in lockstep with Jewish values. So I think to make that into a Jewish story is certainly not our focus, and we've never seen those stories as such, for good and for bad, unless there was something specifically Jewish about it, if there was a Jewish aspect to what was said and what was done, if there was an anti-Semitic aspect, for example, then that makes it more
I agree 100%.
Jewish focus. So
right.
we obviously we covered the basics of what was happening with Harvey Weinstein, but we stepped deeper into it when there was somebody who made the claim that there was something specifically Jewish about his perversions, and we had a piece up saying that that was an untoward way to present things.
Mm-hmm. So where do you imagine, how are you viewed in the Jewish community as a whole in terms of the political Jewish spectrum? Are you seen left, right, or center?
Look, that's a good question. I can tell you how we hope to be seen. We when we think about our positioning, we really don't think of ourselves in terms of having allegiance to any political party or even any end of the political spectrum. We try and think about the Jewish interests of the hour and of every given day. And historically, and I've been here at the paper for 8-9 years now, but it goes back further than I. And there were periods, for example, where Republican presidents, when George H.W. Bush wanted to withhold loan guarantees, etc., where what he was doing was not something that was favorable. We were, of course, intensely critical of President Obama, and I think those sentiments were shared by many across the Jewish community, and frankly, many Democrats as well, especially towards the end, who felt betrayed, really, especially with Resolution 2334. And then moving into the current President Trump, there are points where we've been praiseworthy and there are points that we've been critical. We've been quite critical lately of his approach now to Syria and the new deal that they have with the Russians that effectively allow the Iranians to stay on Israel's border, and certainly their approach to the Kurds. So I think we in that respect, our readers and hopefully the leaders see us as a fair voice. We're looking at the issues and we're judging the issues without a particular allegiance to any political party.
Mm-hmm. You take a position on the two-state solution?
We haven't, well, in the news section, I would say that there isn't necessarily a position, but there's obviously in our opinion section all kinds of positions.
Have you written about it?
I could tell you my own personal position is that I don't see that as a path that is going to lead to peace, certainly with the players that we have at the table now. And I think it will pursuing that path as things stand now will lead to more bloodshed, more violence. Therefore, I'm against it.
Okay, but are you against it philosophically or are you against it pragmatically?
Well, look, my personal view towards these things is that it's important. The most important aspect has to be the preservation of life. I would say that philosophically, I'm against it because I do not believe that the other side, that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, have any intention of a second state being the end of all claims and therefore leading to peace. And I think that's fundamental. I'm not sure that it can be changed. And until that changes, I don't see that's a workable path.
Okay. By the way, you have said it as I believe it is true, and I've tried to say it here on JBS over and over and over again. I only add one thing. If there were a sea change in Palestinian leadership, and the Palestinian leadership made an honest, not attempt, they were honestly successful in changing the entire rhetoric and attitude of the Muslim, Palestinian, Arab world, so that everything that offends me to the core in what the PA television does, what the PA website does, what Mahmoud Abbas says, what Hamas stands for and what Hamas does, if they changed all of that, and they said to me, we honestly understand we were wrong, I want to live next to Israel as Canada lives next to the United States. Would I, if I thought that were theoretically, not in real life, if it were a theoretical possibility, would I be willing to sacrifice parts of Eretz Israel for a two-state solution? There are some Jews who say, even if the Palestinians became Mother Teresa's, every single one of them, we're not giving up 1 square inch of Eretz Israel because it comes from God or we have some kind of historic claim to it, and we don't care how nice or how honestly the Palestinian wants to live in peace with us. There's no more security issue because they want to. We're not giving up a square inch. I believe that the vast majority of Israelis and Jews worldwide, if they thought there was an honest way to make peace with the Palestinians, they would say yes in a heartbeat. And what you've said is, none of us, including now many on the Israeli left, none of us believe the current Palestinian leadership and mentality would make that possible for one split moment. But that's the difference between a pragmatic, practical answer to the question and a philosophical, theoretical question. For me, philosophically, the Jewish people have always said since 1936, we'll share the land. We thought it would all be ours, but we'll share it. And from the 1920s till today, the Palestinian world has said, over my dead body. And as a result, there can't be a two-state solution. But if they meant it honestly, I'd have no trouble sharing the land as all of my ancestors from 1936, the Ben-Gurions, right through to whether it was Barak, whether it was Olmert, whether it was Netanyahu at Ben-Gurion University, we would share if it were honest. And my instinct is, that's what you mean.
Well, I wouldn't say exactly so. Certainly, I'm not of the view that because God gave us this entire land, which I believe to be correct, therefore we cannot give up an inch. But I am of the view that according to the Jewish perspective and according to Jewish law, the preservation of life is the most important.
Paramount.
And, you know, I was actually there in Israel during the disengagement from Gaza in 2005.
Where were you there?
I was visiting for the summer. It was a summer trip, but I was able to see firsthand, and I was younger at the time, and I wasn't in the position I am today. But you know, to feel the opposing sides and to see the discussion that was taking place, and a few years later, subsequently, oversee coverage of not one, not two, but 3 wars emanating from that territory. And I think my view on this is, you might probably best described as Jabotinsky-esque, in the sense that what we've seen happen over there, and we've seen that with all territorial concessions, is that it creates an appetite for more. It's a finger that becomes a hand that becomes the arm, and it becomes an invitation for more aggression. So I'm convinced that even if circumstances were to change, and I don't know if those that you might see that as a feasibility at all, but even if circumstances were to change in some way, that these types of territorial concessions might result in greater demands and would actually send the Palestinians or whoever we were negotiating with back in the other direction towards taking a more belligerent approach. I think the history has proven that the more we've given, the more they want. And that was, Jabotinsky's philosophy of the iron wall, if you will, because, the first thing and peace is something that we strive for and something that we desperately want to achieve. But the first step towards achieving the peace is showing that there's a futility in continued conflict. And that involves really creating, assigning, confirming the permanence of the Jewish presence in that land.
Well, I think you said beautifully, and I'm going to say again, I agree 100%. And there is a follow-up question to the fact that I agree with you. But I say to you gently, you didn't accept my premise. My premise was, it was an honest change. What you say to me is basically, they can't change. I'm saying to you, the Messiah comes. And there's a change. Philosophically, would you have a problem if you knew for an eternal fact the Palestinians were ready to live with you in peace and give up the right of return and give up any notion that they would one day take over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa, which to them is no different than Ariel, not one iota different than Ariel or Ma'ale Adumim or Kiryat Arba. There's no difference to them. But in my scenario, the Messiah has come and they change. And then the question is philosophical, not how do we survive? Because I'm asking you philosophically, would you be willing to give up Judea, Samaria land if it meant by doing so, you would never have a child go to war again in the state of Israel? And you're going to say to me, well, I don't believe that's possible. Yes, I know you don't believe it's possible, and I want the audience to understand, I don't believe it's possible, which again is going to prompt my next question. But I also say that if it were possible, yes, I would be willing to give up land and share what was Eretz Yisrael on the west side of the Jordan River to live alongside the Palestinian community in peace, even if I couldn't have as much of the land as possible. Theoretically, I have no problem saying yes. Although I don't think it's going to happen. And you? I don't want to hear you don't accept my premise.
Yeah, look, I think that you're giving me two buckets, okay? I'm going to create a third bucket, okay?
Yes.
You have practically, you have philosophically.
Yes.
The philosophical has two parts to it.
Go ahead.
I would say you have the Jabotinsky view, and you have, let's say, the Rav Kook view.
Okay.
Okay, so the one you're describing is the Rav Kook view.
Correct.
I'm in the Jabotinsky bucket.
Okay. Okay. And for everyone to understand, Jabotinsky would never have accepted the dialectic as I describe it. So my next question is this.
Yes.
Since we do agree on what the reality is, you've now been at this for a while. You've been at this 10 years now?
Almost, yeah.
Okay.
9 years.
There's a question I can't get an answer to. Maybe you have an answer, or maybe you've heard an answer. It seems so obvious to me what the reality is, why there's no peace in the Middle East. And we have an irredentist Palestinian community. And I don't care about individual Palestinians. I care about who's the leadership. The leadership of the Palestinian community believes that we are a rogue, illegitimate presence in the Middle East. There should be no Jewish sovereignty anywhere. That ultimately they don't want to ever acknowledge that the Jewish state has a legitimacy, an international, if not intrinsic, legitimacy of its own, and that ultimately they want from the river to the sea. And if anybody goes on any college campus where there's a strong Palestinian BDS movement. That's the chant. The chant is not withdraw from the West Bank. The chant is from the river to the sea.
That's correct.
Okay, and since it's so obvious, explain to me how you answer this for yourself. Why is it administration after administration doesn't get it? And why is it there are decent, well-meaning, committed, pro-Israel Jews who don't get it? I want you to answer those two questions for me. Why doesn't the American administration get what you and I, we believe it is as plain as day? And why is it well-meaning liberal Jews, and I consider myself a liberal Jew, I just get it. But there are many liberal Jews who think I'm crazy. How is that possible, Dovid?
Well, let me, I want to answer each one differently because I think there are different reasons over here. I will start with the US and foreign governments because that's an easy one. You know, diplomacy is not an exercise that involves the pursuit of truth necessarily. Mm-hmm. It's a balancing act. It's a juggling exercise where there are multiple competing interests that the State Department has to take into consideration, and its goal is to remain on helpful terms with as many of the parties as possible. And sometimes there are contradictions that emerge. Their instinct is not to move in a moral direction, in the truthful direction, the ethical direction. It's to move in a practical direction, what you might call the realpolitik direction. And
is there validity to that?
For the State Department? I mean, I don't think there's a moral validity to it, and I think it's unfortunate when a country like the United States does not take the moral position, but there is a logical validity to it in terms of the State Department approach to things. There are competing interests pulling in different directions, and I think our goal as a community has to be to show and to educate, to inform how there's much more for the US, for the State Department, for other Western countries, for France, for the UK, for Germany, to gain by being wholly committed to Israel's cause, and far more to lose by dallying on the other side. And you know, in the long term, there are interests that are jeopardized as a product and as a result of that. And I think we've moved steadily over some years in that direction. I mean, the Arabist State Department, yes, there's quite a lot of that still exists, but not quite in the way that it has historically. So, and also Israel's position has become much stronger militarily and economically and in technology and research and cyber defense. So Israel at the same time has been able to assert itself more confidently on the global stage. So I think we're making slow and steady progress in that regard. But there's still more that needs to be done. In terms of the Jews, okay, there are lots of different views on this. I would say that personally I lean towards the more charitable view, and that is that Jews perhaps could be best compared to atheists in the sense that if you take a poll of atheists while their feet are on the ground, you'll get one number, but if you'll take a poll of atheists in a plane that's about to crash, you might get another number. And I think American Jews and a lot of Western Jews have in their hearts, certainly the majority, 90%, 80%, whatever it is, have in their hearts the desire to do right by Israel. They understand the importance of it. They understand the centrality of it. But in order to understand the complexities and the details of the threats that Israel faces, you have to have a lot of knowledge. And this is something that's easy for you because this is a world that you live in and have been actively engaged in. But for your average person, it's difficult. And, you know, the evidence of this, there's a lot of evidence from this. I mean, the polls show this. For example, you know, I think there was a Gallup poll done during the last war in Gaza when the Obama administration was criticizing the steps Israel was taking to secure itself almost every second day. And the poll asked American Jews if they're supportive of Israel at this time. And 93% said yes. To get 93% of American Jews to agree on something is incredible. But I'll take it a step further. You know, you have a president, the previous president, and certain organizations as well, J Street or others, who take a position that is contrary to the will of the Israeli government. Very clearly, I don't think that's disputable, right? And, you know, these are, to take President Obama, for example, he took a straightforward issue on straightforward position on so many different issues, whether it's pro-life or pro-choice, or whether it's for entitlements and other, whatever position, whatever issue he's willing to take a position. Why did he have a problem coming out and saying, you know something, I'm more of a pro-Palestinian president. I'm not such a pro-Israel president. I mean, why was that a challenge for him to say? Why was it necessary for him to engage in these ideological gymnastics and say, well, you know, this is actually in Israel's best interest. Let me tell you what's in Israel's best interest, regardless of what the Israeli government is saying. You know, why does he have to say, you know, he gets up and says about the Iran deal, it blocks every single pathway to the bomb, and the reason we support it is because it makes Israel safer. You know, why did he see it as a necessary component of his argument? And the reason is because he understands this. He understands that the American Jewish community wants to do right by Israel in its core. But he also understands that, unfortunately, there is a great deal of ignorance, and he works to take advantage of that. So when he gets up and says this deal will block every pathway to the bomb, he understands how that you have to be immensely knowledgeable to know that that is nonsense. You have to know about heavy water and light water and plutonium enrichment and uranium enrichment and past military dimensions. Who knows about this stuff? It's less than 1% of the U.S. community, and God knows what small percentage of the Jewish community. So they're able to take advantage of the ignorance to position themselves as pro-Israel, but taking positions that are completely contrary to not just the sitting Israeli government. I mean, on the Iran deal, the opposition was completely on the same page as Likud. There was no difference between Labour and Likud on this issue. So I think, in short, and that's a long Megillah of an answer to your question, I think the challenge that we have in the Jewish community is that we need to be more informed, and I think the more that Jews understand about the challenges that Israel and the Jewish community face, the more instinctively supportive they are of the Jewish position and of the position that Israel is taking.
So I want to react to the administration analysis. And you talked about, you know, there's a reason to be pragmatic from their perspective. But if the goal is to make peace, if peace in the Middle East would be beneficial to American interests, that's what we're told is true. Maybe it's not true. But if it is true, you and I know that the best way to make peace is for the United States to say to the Palestinians, if you want our support, you got to knock it off. And you've got to recognize the state of Israel, and you got to mean it. And you've got to cut all this nonsense that we see on Palestinian television, and that's on the Palestinian website. And you got to stop paying bonuses and pensions to people who stab civilians in the street or run them over with cars. And if you don't, we're not going to have anything to do with you. And if you want our support, by the way, we'll give you a lot of support. Israel will give you support. You can build a very lovely society, state for yourself with a lot of money. But if you don't, we're on Israel's side. There's no daylight between us. And in the end, we're going to do nothing to prevent Israel from establishing whatever it wants to establish on the West Bank or anywhere else. That seems to me to be in America's interest. To say to the Palestinians, we're not blind, we understand, it's unacceptable. Why is it acceptable to America, Dovid? The Palestinians can say out loud, a Palestinian state will be Judenrein, where we would not accept that with any other people anywhere on the planet Earth. But America doesn't say to the Palestinians, how dare you say that there's going to be no Jew living in Palestine. And why can't this settlement, if it wants to stay there under a Palestinian flag, stay there under a Palestinian flag? You have Arab communities, Palestinian communities inside Israel, living under the Israeli flag. Why can't there be the same thing? If America really wanted peace, why wouldn't it say to the Palestinians, why wouldn't it read to the Palestinians a riot act? So that when you say to me that the administration has interests in their geopolitical, I say to myself, I don't understand still. And the one word you did not use either to describe the administration's dealings with the Mideast conflict or with Jewish problems with Israel is anti-Semitism. Either anti-Semitism in the State Department or subtly in the American government. And we hear all the time about the worst kind of anti-Semite is a Jewish anti-Semite. And although they may not be anti-Semites, the Jewish problem with Israel may be, as you describe, a product of abysmal ignorance. But I don't understand it emotionally. So I want you to, just react to both these things again.
Well, look, I think first of all, when you speak about the American government, it's obviously not a monolithic entity. There are different parts to the American government that have different interests. Certainly the goal of the State Department is not necessarily the goal of peace. The goal of the State Department is to maintain good relations with as many countries as will be beneficial as possible. And if that involves some kind of song and dance or the staging of some kind of discussions, that's part of the game, as it were. The White House is supposed to have a different agenda, and I think very often there is actually a tug of war between the White House and the State Department, and also various elements in Congress. And under the Obama administration, you had quite a probably historical overlap, in the sense that they were very, very much in sync.
In what way?
In terms of their approach to Iran, in terms of their approach to Israel.
That you would say was detrimental to Israel.
That was very detrimental to Israel, of course. But, typically or historically, the White House has pushed in the more moral direction towards Israel's position and away from the State Department. That wasn't the case with Obama. Obama, in fact, pushed the State Department further into the other direction.
Yes, and 70% of the Jewish community votes not simply Democrat. They were enthusiastic about President Obama.
Yes, that's correct.
70%.
That's correct. And that's my response to that, I would say, is along the lines of what we discussed earlier. Okay, the charitable view of why that took place, why it happened that way. Having said that, I think we're now moving into a very interesting era in terms of the White House's relationship with this issue, and I think it's actually the closest it's ever been to a riot act approach. For now, there is a level of caution because the folks that are leading this, namely Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, are trying to take a slow, reasonable, cautious approach to the issue. But I think in terms of the president's instincts, in terms of kind of the general thrust of the administration, in terms of how they see things, they have put far more focus on issues like the payments to terrorists and other issues than anybody previously has, any administration previously had. They've paid far more attention to the facts, to the truths of the conflict than any previous administration has. Mm-hmm. And I think, if you look at the President Trump's style in terms of his negotiating tactics and how he works to position his opponents even before he comes, or his subjects before he comes to the negotiating table. What he's done now with the issue of moving the embassy, with his desire not to commit himself to the two-state solution, he's created now sticks, if you will, that are suspended over the Palestinians. That are frankly ready to fall if they don't respond to some of the issues he's been pushing. For example, the terror payments, which is not just a problem because it's rewarding terrorism, it's a substantive existential issue. It explains as clear as day what the Palestinian objectives are and how they view this conflict. And turning that into the central issue, I think, is what has been one of the if not the greatest blessing for Israel from the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. most American Jews detest Donald Trump. You've said that there have been things that the Trump administration have done that are positive for the state of Israel. What's your overall, and I don't know whether I would see this in the Algemeiner, what is the assessment of Donald Trump as President of the United States?
I think when you look at Donald Trump and you try to analyze Donald Trump's impact on the United States, on Israel, on the world, the first question you have to ask yourself is, are you willing to compartmentalize your discussion about this person? The answer for many of his opponents is no, in which case this is usually not a very helpful discussion to have. From where we stand, and and when I mean compartmentalize, I mean separate the policies and what's being enacted and the things that are being said from the personality and everything that comes with that. From our perspective, from where we stand as a publication, we have a responsibility, I think, to address the issues, to focus more on what is being done and how that affects the future. And very often there are things that are being said that need to be responded to as well. But I think there's been, certainly among his opponents, an inability to separate the two and to be able to come up with some objective and helpful thoughts on the two separate issues. I can tell you that from where the Israelis stand, they absolutely cannot believe their luck. The difference between this administration and the previous administration in terms of, and I mean only in terms of the issues that concern them, it's a difference of night and day. It's heaven and hell when it comes to how they view Iran as the problem of the region, as opposed to the Obama administration that view Iran as a solution in the region. I mean, these are, there was an Israeli general who said recently that 80% of Israel's security threats are a product of Iran. So these are fundamental issues for the Israelis, frankly, on both sides of the aisle in Israel. And I think in that respect, if you're thinking narrowly through the lens of Jewish security, the Trump administration has added a great deal more than it's taken away. There is obviously, and I think it's important to mention, a challenging aspect of it, and that is, I think everybody in the community, the Jewish community, would like to see him do a lot more and be more straightforward and forthright in his approach to nationalists in this country, ultra-nationalists, white nationalists, and Jew haters. I think Charlottesville was a great example. But I think it's hard to make the case that this is a president that has any ill feeling towards Jews or even feels sympathetic towards the Charlottesville types. But there are aspects of his personality that make him respond to criticism in a very defensive fashion. I think the way to get the best results out of this president, specifically, if you're not accusing him of being an anti-Semite, if you're accusing him of not doing enough to combat anti-Semitism, the right approach is to be encouraging, to be supportive, to offer assistance, to say, we'd like to help you to do more, we'd like to see you do more, but to take the approach that is constructive as opposed to belligerent, I think will result in a better conclusion.
How do you feel about his decision? It has not yet been implemented, but when UNESCO, the United Nations cultural arm, was just critical of Israel in some horrendous ways and changed the names of historical sites so that the Hebrew or Jewish name was no longer associated with it and Muslim names became authoritative. And this time, Donald Trump said, we're withdrawing from UNESCO. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I think this has been one of the real bright spots that I think everybody has recognized from all sides of the pro-Israel community. It's the approach that this administration has taken at the UN with Nikki Haley at the helm. I think she's universally loved in the Jewish community that I see, and this is something that Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, said recently, that before this change, the Palestinians ruled the UN, And that's no longer the case. The United States has set the tone. And this kind of carrot and stick approach, the threat to withdraw funds, I think is the right approach. It's the only approach that that UNESCO or other rogue elements at the UN are likely to understand. And it really makes a difference. It makes people think twice, even if it doesn't change things on the ground. Immediately, it helps people understand that there is a cost to reflexively taking the Arab position on these issues.
And again, at the same time, there is, in general, just almost a repulsion over the fact that Donald Trump, who would have imagined someone like Donald Trump would be president of the United States? And in the Jewish community, especially in anything other than the most religious or even far right in the Jewish community, there is a disappointment with and he's going to mean the end of the world. Have you heard that, David? He's going
Sure.
Yeah. Where do you think that comes from?
That's a very good question, among many that you've asked today. I think that there is an element of mob mentality, if you will, around the discussions about Donald Trump, where
Mentality.
There's a race for one to outdo the other. I mean, yes, there's a great deal to criticize.
Absolutely.
But let me tell you, the people that are kind of jumping up and down and screaming without even taking a break to pause, yet had very little to say when red lines were crossed in Syria and 500,000 people were killed, or even when the Iran deal was enacted and everything that came with that. There's a bit of hypocrisy here that I think it's worthwhile to point out. It's important to be consistent, and I think, yes, there is a lot to be concerned about. There's also plenty to recognize, and I think there's also, if people want to have a constructive or any kind of relationship with this administration, and I think it's important for the Jewish community always to be engaged. It's important that when they do something right, they say that we're happy and that you've done something right. And it's only then that you have a chance of being heard, when there's something that you're really concerned about.
Extend this now to the dynamic we see in the Jewish community as a whole. It seems like it is very hard for people with opposing views, especially political, to talk with one another. Conversation, dialogue, seems to have become much more difficult inside the Jewish community than I can ever remember. Now, you're seeing it as editor-in-chief of the Algemeiner. What's your analysis of this? First of all, do you agree with me that it is at the moment the sad state of affairs? And if you agree, what's your analysis of it?
Look, the polarization, I would say, is a symptom of our times, and it's not just in the Jewish community. It's in the whole of the country and frankly the world. And there's a level of entrenchment, and there are, I think, a lot of causes behind it, including the way that the movement of information is evolving and how people effectively can position themselves inside information bubbles where they're only exposed to one view of the world, and they don't have the opportunity to hear from others and at least be aware of other views. So I think it's a great shame, and it's a great, it's a product of how our society has evolved. But having said that, I think the tools also exist for us to break out of that, and the democratization of information, and the idea that so many people are getting information from Facebook, where everybody is exposed to others and could really, if they pay attention, see other views. I don't think there's any compulsion to accept those views, but civility is certainly important. You can make your case as vociferously and confidently and aggressively as you would like, but to have respect for the person, even if you don't have respect for the views, I think it's important for the fabric of society, and it's something that we have to do better at for our children and for future generations.
Yes. And David, do you live in your own bubble?
Well, that's, I hope not. I really hope not.
You hope to expose yourself, you try to expose yourself to different ideas and points of view.
Yes, I think it's a very important for someone who is attempting to speak to a broad audience as we are. I think it's a very, very important exercise to be as familiar as possible with as many different opposing views as possible. And I think ultimately it's important even to solidify one's own views and to gain a better understanding of one's own views, to make an effort to understand others.
But wait, I applaud you. I wish that your philosophy were one that was commonplace throughout the Jewish world. And I am saddened by the fact that, again, I'm talking about really good, responsible people who feel that to even hear the other side is somehow a betrayal of some moral imperative, and that as a result they never do. And the Jewish tradition has been so embracing of this view and this view, as both are Divrei Elohim Chayim. Words from different sources are, in fact, the words of the living God. And one can learn from people, even one that one disagrees with. So when I hear you say this, as a journalist, I think it's even more your responsibility. But I think as a manner of just how one goes through the world, you say it so beautifully and so wonderfully.
That's very kind. I would say, though, that not necessarily that both of them are Divrei Elohim Chaim, because sometimes there's a view that's right and a view that's wrong. But the importance of listening to the other view, even if it's a wrong view, is valuable for the fabric of our society.
Yes. If this were a different program, we would debate the nuance of Elohim Chaim. But at the moment, we'll leave it alone. We understand. We're saying the same thing in a slightly different way. So what about now your experience with the Israeli politician? Most of us have a sense of our own politicians. You have, fortunately, have had experience with Israeli politicians that the typical American Jew does not have. You've heard what I've heard. People on both sides of the ocean do not like Benjamin Netanyahu, and some love him. What's your analysis of the Israeli politician? And for that matter, how do you view the Netanyahu government?
Well, I think, look, as with all leaders, and I guess following our discussion, our earlier talk, there has to be an aspect of compartmentalization. There is internal, domestic, there's the personality, there's the relationship with the diaspora. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has his challenges and certainly understand some of the criticism that people have against him, some legitimate, some not legitimate. Having said that, Israel is a vociferous democracy, and time again, when you speak with people on the street in Israel, you get into your average taxi and you say to them, what do you think of Bibi? What do they always say? First, they start with an insult. Who's shakran? He's a liar. Or they'll throw something else out. And then they'll say, aval ein mishehu acher.
Exactly.
But there's nobody else. And to reach that kind of status, I think, in a nation, there's a reason for it. There's a reason for it. Here you have a man who has dedicated heart and soul and his entire life to the well-being of the Jewish cause. It was something that, it was a product of his history, his upbringing, his father, losing his brother, a confluence of circumstances in his upbringing that can't be recreated, that are historic, that are once in a lifetime. And I think he has achieved for Israel, and I'm setting aside now domestic policies. On the world stage, he has brought Israel into a new era in terms of its relations with countries across the world, in terms of its projection as a force to be reckoned with on the diplomatic stage, but mostly as a nation that other nations want to be friends with for their own interests, not just for moral reasons or because they are inspired by the plucky Jewish state as it was in the early days, or because they feel sorry for Israel. Oh my goodness, it's surrounded by so many hostile countries. But because there is a legitimate view as equals, that we can sit at the same table and we have a lot to offer each other. And what the Prime Minister has done in relations with China, relations with India, relations with Russia even, which are complex but have advanced tremendously in recent years, going for the first time to Africa, to Singapore, to Australia, to South America. I mean, this Prime Minister, I think, will go down in history as one of the Israeli greats.
Mm-hmm. How often do you get to Israel?
I try to go as often as possible.
Okay.
It's twice a year, I would say, is good. Once a year.
And how do you feel about Israel?
Israel?
What makes Israel wonderful for you, Dovid?
Israel is wonderful because it is a nation state that serves as a light to all other nations. It's the national embodiment of the Jewish purpose.
Is it wonderful because it's a rival of Silicon Valley?
No.
Okay. It's a
nice bonus.
Is it wonderful because it produces more Nobel laureates per capita than any other nation in the world?
Another nice bonus.
Yes. And I feel a lot of what is described about Israel as wonderful, is the bonus. And that there's an essential essence to who the Israeli people are and what the Israeli people are trying to create in a very, very difficult situation. And that in some way the state of Israel is, as you said it, you epitomized it in the phrase, light unto the nations. And all I'm doing is sort of fleshing that out. For me, the Israeli people, and they're only people, they're just human beings. They're not messianic figures, but that they're doing an extraordinary job of creating an experiment in democratic society where they are doing their level best to incorporate into their society in as fair a way as possible, as human beings working at it are, creating a place for the non-Jewish Arab Israeli to live in peace and with as much advantage and opportunity as the Israeli. And Israel is not yet a messianic state. There are things it has to do better. But it seems to me it is an example of a societal experiment of magnificence. And that when one goes to Israel, beside the fact that one feels when one steps on the earth somehow different than one feels anywhere else, and America is also my home, and whenever I'm in Israel, I'm at home there. I get it. But why I think Israel is so wonderful is what the people of Israel are trying to do and create and have created as a social experiment that represents the finest of what not only the Jewish tradition has to offer, but every human aspiration is reflected in its finest in the state of Israel.
Right.
Are you comfortable with my saying this?
I'm comfortable with you saying it, and I think I would go even a step further, and that is, morality and what the Jewish people are supposed to represent is complex. And I heard this, I think it was from Ambassador Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., who says an Israeli prime minister never has a choice between black and white. He's peddling in shades of gray, many different shades of gray. And I think morality is often like that. You know, there's a statement that comes from the Talmud. It says, he who is merciful to the cruel will end up being cruel to the merciful. And I think in many ways that's also a lesson that Israel has been able to teach the world, recognizing right and wrong and being as aggressive in your pursuit of evil as you are in your praising and elevation of good. And, you know, take, for example, the challenge that now every country in Europe is being faced with more and more, and that is you're facing a population, sometimes an internal population that is sometimes hostile. And there's a balance between securing your public and then securing people's freedoms. And this was a subject that Israel's been dealing with now for decades and decades and decades. When you're faced with this type of internal threat, how are you able to balance the two, to protect while at the same time and secure, while at the same time respecting the individual rights and the freedoms? And Israel has been greatly criticized for the approach that it's taken very often. But the truth is that the model that it's created is a blueprint for dealing with these very, very difficult challenges that Israel would do, that Europe would do very well to learn from Israel. So the message, I think, and what Israel has to, the gifts that Israel brings to the world are not only on the easy issues, but even more so on the difficult issues. And I think, yes, there's always things to criticize, but if you look at the whole, if you look at how the society has responded and reacted and implemented its security needs in very, very trying circumstances, this will hold up historically as one of the greatest implementations of a moral society throughout history.
Boy, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking to myself, you know, as you said, I love the way you say it. It was a bonus. How did you say when I said to you about Silicon Valley?
A bonus.
It's a bonus, yeah. What moves me is when I hear that the State of Israel sets up a mobile hospital on the Israeli side of the Syrian border to care for not Israelis, but Syrians who are wounded in the Syrian civil war. And they come across into Israel, are treated, and are sent back. They can't even say where they got treated. For Israel to do that, to me, what makes Israel wonderful? That makes Israel, to me, wonderful. What makes Israel wonderful? To me, it's that there is an Arab Israeli as the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. That is extraordinary to me. And it means much more to me than the iPhone or a chip inside my phone or a camera I can swallow and the doctors can see inside me. And I'm thrilled that Israel created these things. But it's on the human side.
Well, those things that you mentioned are a product of who Israel is,
yes,
as opposed to what Israel does,
yes,
which are separate categories, similar but separate.
Yes, gorgeous. Okay, so let's end where we began. I come back to the Algemeiner. What's the challenge now for you? You know, we're meeting toward the end of 2017. As you head into 2018 and beyond, what's the challenge for the Algemeiner as you see it from your perch as editor-in-chief?
I think the answer to your question is as follows. And I want to give the right credit because it's a thought that's not my own. I read it actually in Haaretz newspaper. It was written by a columnist, but I just can't recall whose idea it was. And they made a very, very interesting point that essentially the institutions of Jewish leadership in this country that have been established were established with something of a shtetl mentality from the old country. In the old country, you had a scenario where you had the landowner, the poritz, as they called him, who was in charge of everything. And the Jews were very focused on staying on good terms with this guy. And if you were good with him, you were fine, and the Jewish community was safe. And coming to the United States, there were a lot of organs of Jewish advocacy that were established, major, large Jewish organs, but mostly with the same thought in mind, with the same concept in mind. Establish relationships with people in power. And that is how you're able to get your message as a community across. And I think, we can go through all of the organizations from the AIPAC to the World Jewish Congress to the American Jewish Committee. They're all based on a similar fundamental. Some of them are focused on political leaders, on diplomatic leaders, on international leaders, on domestic leaders. But the concept is very much the same. I think we're moving now into a world where it's no longer enough to create a relationship and then whisper in the halls of power and advocate for whatever the Jewish interest of the day is. We have to understand in the information age how to speak to the broadest possible audience, how to speak to the American public, how to speak to the international public. This is the evolution, the democratization of information, which is probably as significant an event as the invention of printing, that creates incredible opportunities for the Jewish voice to be heard. And I would say, if there's one thing I would say, is that let's recognize this and take hold of the great opportunities that exist in the information age, and understand, that there's a challenge here. There's also a great opportunity, but this is the way of the future, and it's time for us to embrace it.
You are our future. You are fabulous. You are a treasure. David, you're a treasure. By the way, first of all, you're wise way beyond your years. What you're doing is a service to the Jewish people.
Thank you.
Unlike any other. I am so proud to be a colleague of yours. You always have a home in that seat. I hope you'll come here as often as you possibly can.
It's so close.
It's
so easy to get.
Kol tuv v'hatzlacha.
Thank you.
All you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll do it again.
Dovid Efune, editor-in-chief of the Algemeiner, director also of its parent nonprofit organization, the Gershon Jacobson Foundation. Do yourself a favor. Be sure you're visiting the Algemeiner Journal all the time. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed by Dovid Efune here on L'chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.